Hey everyone, football is here. It's September. The preseason is behind us, and we are now in episode number 7 of the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. I am Anthony Cosenza, joined by my partner in crime, Connor Howe, and we have a special guest this week to help preview the Bengals season opener in New York against the Jets. John Butchko from Gangrene Nation. He also runs a podcast over there called the Lockdown Jets podcast, which Cincy Jungle's Rebecca Toback was just on that show this week, so make sure you check that out. I think you're on iTunes and everything, right, John?
iTunes and Audio Boom. That's right.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here. Maybe just give us just a tiny bit of background in terms of your involvement on the SB Nation network and Gangrene Nation, and maybe a little bit about your show, and then we'll dive into some questions.
Well, I've started it back in 2008. We were at Gangrene Nation, I believe, was actually the 32nd of the 32 Team SB Nation sites. Somehow SB Nation has not fired me yet, so I'm sticking around. We just started a new daily podcast a few weeks ago called the Lockdown Jets podcast. We go 5 days a week, talk about topics about the Jets and the NFL. Like I said, it's on iTunes and Audio Booms, and I'm glad to be on your show tonight.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, and I'm going to just dive right in. I know there's a lot of questions with both teams, but a lot of excitement with both teams. Last year, the Bengals and the Jets combined for 22 regular season wins. The Bengals made the playoffs. The Jets did not, even with a 10-win season. So I think the question, at least that's most prevalent on my mind, because it's the most important position, how has Ryan Fitzpatrick looked given the holdout and his coming back to the team late? Has the offense taken any kind of backslide after he led them to quite a good season last year?
The offense did not look great in the preseason. I think that was true of pretty much any of the four quarterbacks. All four quarterbacks had rough outings. Particularly in the third preseason game, Fitzpatrick was very off. It seemed like his timing was kind of off. I'm not sure how much I would put that on the time he missed in the offseason, though, because he did have a full training camp. Brandon Marshall was also out in that third preseason game, although I'm not sure how much it really impacted him. Fitzpatrick was just really off that night. But, I don't like putting too much stock into preseason. I always think back to, so there have been some horrible Jets seasons where the team was 4-0 in preseason. They were lighting the league on fire. You go in, you're all fired up, and the team goes out and stinks. So I never put too much weight on preseason. I think the question right now with the Jets is, was Fitzpatrick's run late last season the start of a guy who was kind of a late bloomer, maybe somebody who found success? He kind of bounced around the league. Did he find the right team, the right system, the right mix of guys, or was it just kind of a mirage, the product of a soft schedule? I don't think that's a question that was going to be answered in training camp or preseason. I think we'll start to answer it this Sunday.
Okay, so another addition. I know Ryan Fitzpatrick was an addition of sorts. He came back. How do you see Matt Forte, another big free agent acquisition, even though he's kind of at the tail end of his career? How do you see him fitting into this offense, and has he looked to have lost a step, or is he still got some spring in his step with the Jets?
So he did not play a ton in preseason. He was a little banged up early in training camp. The way I view Forte, as much as I view him as the number one back, I almost view him more as the number 3 receiver. Last year, the Jets went on a 5-game winning streak in December, and it was really on the backs of the offense. They really kind of found their identity as a passing team. And the thing that really stuck out about that stretch was the emergence of Bilal Powell, who was a back out of Louisville, the Jets drafted in 2011, and he had kind of had an unremarkable career to that point. But for that 5-game stretch, he became the third leading receiver on the team. There was an abnormal amount of targets were concentrated between the top 2 receivers, Brandon Marshall and Eric Decker. The Jets really did not have much beyond them. During that 5-game stretch, Powell kind of emerged as that weapon that kind of could make teams pay for focusing too much on Marshall and Decker. And so I kind of view what the Jets saw in that stretch is how effective they were with a back as their third receiver. So what they did was they went out and got one of the best receiving backs of his generation in Forte to fill that role. And they also brought Powell back because I think Forte is an aging back. You kind of want to keep him on a pitch count. You don't want to overwork him too much early in the season because you want him fresh in December and hopefully January for the playoffs. So I think, it's like I said, I think as much as these guys are backs, the Jets are also going to utilize them as receivers out of the backfield. The guy that was the number one back last year was Chris Ivory, who had probably the best year of his career, but he wasn't really much of a receiver out of the backfield. He did improve during his tenure with the Jets. During that first year, 2013, when he was with the Jets, I joked that he looked like he was allergic to catching the football. I've never seen a back look so bad as a receiver. He developed into a guy who could catch he could catch a screen, he could catch a dump off pass, but he wasn't a guy who could split wide. He's not really a guy who could burn a linebacker on a wheel route. Forte is a guy who brings a more diverse skill set when it comes to catching the ball out of the backfield.
All right, thanks, man. I've got another question for you, and it kind of pertains to the run game. So obviously Sheldon Richardson is going to be out of this week 1 matchup with his 1-game suspension. And so the run game is obviously going to be pretty contingent on Muhammad Wilkerson and Leonard Williams stepping up. I think it's also easy to forget that Damon Harrison, Snacks, was one of the best run stuffers in the league. And obviously the Jets had a top 5 run defense in the league last year. How do you see the defensive line holding up with brand new starter, and I believe it's McClendon who's the nose tackle, and then with Sheldon Richardson out for week 1?
I think that even with Richardson out, this is a very deep, talented unit. I'm not going to say they're going to shut the Bengals' run game down, but I don't think that this line is going to be overwhelmed by any team in the league that they face. I mean, like I said, I think this could be a pretty even matchup, but I don't think that this line will ever go into a game at a disadvantage, even with Richardson out.
Yeah, that's totally fair. And then obviously the big matchup, which everyone knows is coming, is the whole AJ Green versus Darrelle Revis matchup. And obviously we both know both of those players are top-tier players at each of their respective positions. I'm just more curious as to Darrelle Revis as a player. Last year he was obviously playing through a minor injury, or I'm not sure how significant the injury was, so I shouldn't say minor, but we saw him lose a step. He's not going to be in his prime Darrelle Revis Island, but he's still one of the best corners in the NFL. He's probably not going to be manned on AJ Green the entire game, but they'll definitely still see some snaps head to head. What do you think? Do you think that Revis is still capable of locking down any wide receiver regardless of circumstance?
I think he's capable of it, but I don't think he's as much of a sure thing as he used to be. Back in his heyday, 2009, 2010, whenever you sent him out there against an elite receiver, you knew that a receiver was not getting anything that day. Now you're not quite as sure, where you feel confident that Revis can go out there and win his battles. You're not surprised if he goes out there and wins, but it's also not as much of a shock to see one of these elite receivers go out and have a game against him the way DeAndre Hopkins did last year. I think it's more of a fair fight than it used to be. There's not really an outcome that's going to surprise me this week. I think, as you said, I would be kind of surprised if the Jets left him on an island for the whole game, because I think as I look at the Cincinnati team, I kind of feel like you want to do everything you can to take Green away and force Andy Dalton to use kind of his secondary targets. And in all truth, the cornerbacks beyond Revis are a concern, but I think the Jets' best shot at winning this game will be to try do everything they can to neutralize Green. So I'm sure there are going to be points. The Jets will pick their spots to leave Revis and Green one-on-one. I think you have some confidence in him. It's not the sure thing it used to be, but I think that's probably what you're looking at this week.
We're talking with John Butchko from the Lockdown Jets podcast and Gang Green Nation, previewing the Bengals at Jets Week 1 coming up here Sunday, 1 p.m. Eastern. John, I look to the Bengals have a very solid defensive line in terms of their starters. Their depth, because of injuries that they've accrued this offseason and other attrition there, the backups have a lot to be desired behind the formidable starters, but the Jets' offensive line seems to be in a little bit of flux as well. DeBrickshaw Ferguson retired, so they brought in, I think via trade, Ryan Clady. And then you have a new starter filling in for Gio Camini on the right side there, and he'll be going up one-on-one. I think it's Ben I don't know how to pronounce his last name.
I think it's Ijalana.
Yeah,
don't quote me.
yeah. So
I'm the Jets guy, and I don't know.
So how do you see some of those matchups playing out with those Bengals starters and maybe some of those guys who are stepping into a starting role for the first time for the Jets this year?
I'm not sure there's going to be a huge drop-off from Giacomini to Ijalana, and it actually could also be Brent Cavale, Qvale.
Okay.
But the reason I think there might not be a huge drop-off is not because the backup is that great. It's because Giacomini is one of the lower-rated starting right tackles in the league. The matchup against the Cincinnati defensive line is one that concerns me. And I think that this offense is kind of predicated on spreading the field and getting the ball out quickly to neutralize the pass rush more than it is having your offensive lines stone the pass rush. So I think it's going to be predicated on the Jets receivers, particularly Brandon Marshall and Eric Decker, winning their matchups more than it's going to be on the offensive line winning the day.
Speaking of that matchup with Brandon Marshall and Eric Decker, I love for you to touch a little bit more on that. Obviously, Marshall and Decker, two of the premier wide receivers in the NFL. I'd say they're both probably top 20-ish. Marshall, obviously. And last year, obviously, they both played super, super, super well. And everything seemed to click with Fitzpatrick, Chan Gailey, and just the entire offense. Do you think that Marshall – where do you think he is on the pecking order in terms of wide receivers? And do you think that Marshall and Decker are going to have a repeat of success this season?
I think Marshall is one of the top receivers in the league. Now, I'm not sure his numbers are going to be as good as they were last year. I think part of that is that you've incorporated Forte in the passing game. Jets have a kind of wide receiver tight end hybrid named Quincy Enunwa who kind of flashed near the end of the year. I think he'll be more involved in the passing game. So, the statistics may not be what they were a year ago. His targets may be down. I think he's probably not an Antonio Brown. He's not a Odell Beckham, but Marshall's probably in that next tier. Decker, I always viewed as, even going back to his Denver days, as kind of one of the best second bananas in the league. He's not really a guy you want to build your passing game around, but if you have a guy who can take attention away from him, he's pretty good. One of the things that a lot of people may not realize is that, you think of Decker back in Denver where he was on the outside with Peyton Manning throwing him the ball. The Jets actually moved him in. He's now the Jets' full-time slot receiver. And it was a way that Chan Gailey, the offensive coordinator, created mismatches last year where they used Decker to kind of take advantage of smaller slot corners, and they used Decker's route running ability to create advantages. I think the big question for the Jets is who's going to emerge as the number 3 receiver on the outside. Most Jets fans would hope that it'll be an undrafted rookie named Robbie Anderson, who was one of the top receivers in the NFL during the preseason, earned a spot on the roster, but we are talking about an undrafted rookie. He was doing it mainly against backups and third stringers. It remains to be seen how that's going to translate to regular season action against teams that are game planning to try and stop this offense.
All right, John. So I think the Bengals have not won playing the Jets on the Jets home stadium since 1981, I believe, is the last time the Bengals won there. Your score prediction and prediction of the outcome of this game and kind of what you think is the major tipping point as to why you went that way with the score.
I would be surprised to see a blowout either way. I would not be shocked to see the Bengals win this game. Of course, I'm going to pick the Jets, though. I'm sorry, guys. I don't want to be a rude guest.
Wouldn't expect otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, you're all good, man.
I like the way this Jets defense matches up against the Bengals. I think that they can stop the run game, even with Richardson out. I think that they can game plan to take away Green. I think it comes down to whether the secondary options in the Cincy passing game are able to produce. I think the Jets will do enough defensively, and I think that I like the matchups between the Jets receivers and the Bengals corner. So I'll say 2017 Jets.
Fair enough, and it's a good point about the Jets defense. They are going up against a first-time offensive coordinator for the Bengals in Ken Zampese. He's been a long-time assistant and position coach, but he's taken over for Hugh Jackson, who left for the Browns. Well, John Butchko, Gangrene Nation, and the Lockdown Jets podcast, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. I know it's a little bit late in your neck of the woods, but I think, as you said, I think it's going to be a close one this Sunday, and it should be a pretty fun one. So have some fun on Sunday and continue the great coverage.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Appreciate it. That was John Butchko with Gangrene Nation and the Lockdown Jets podcast. Great guy, great insight, and also we loved having him on the Orange and Black Insider as our second guest of this very young podcast, but we've had two quality ones. So thanks to John for tuning in. Before we get to some more thoughts about that game, let's take a look at the final roster and how the Bengals devised some things. And obviously they had to get kind of creative with all of the injuries that occurred throughout training camp, especially on the defensive line and some other attrition there and, tight end areas like that. There are a couple of trouble spots. There are a couple of spots that seem deeper than originally thought. So, Scott, I'll start with you. What do you make, first of all, of the situation with PJ Dawson? He made the team, then he was waived for another quarterback, and then he had a tryout with the Buccaneers, and then just on Wednesday he was brought back to the fold on the practice squad. So, are you surprised about how that all played out? Are you upset? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll go on record. I guess I have gone on record the last couple of years with bold predictions, kind of being in his camp. So I guess I have a little bit riding on him making the team and doing well. So I was obviously I think a lot of people were surprised to see him cut because he was such a high pick, and the Bengals usually aren't that quick to give up on somebody. And you look at what he has done in preseason when he gets to play. Like the last game, I thought he looked really good. He was good in coverage. There was that tight end. He had a good tackle on him. He came up with the fumble recovery. And it seems like in that limited time, he makes plays, but then at the end of the day, it's the whole thing. He gets limited time. And some of that kind of came out why he was getting the limited time, because he's not a Marvin Lewis kind of guy. He's more of the people he inherited, the Chad Johnson types that he eventually tried to get rid of, the guys who weren't really the hardworking, I live for football kind of mentality.
Me first. Yeah. Me first guys. Yeah.
Yeah. And he, that just seems to be his attitude. And I'm hoping, like a lot of people, I'm hoping this is kind of a wake up call, kick in the pants that, hey, not only were you cut, but no one wanted you. No one added you. The closest thing you got was Tampa, who isn't exactly, a Super Bowl contender. So they obviously need help. They looked at you and they're like, yeah, okay, we're going to pass. And I know he wasn't graded really high on a lot of that spark stuff, the speed, the same things that they ding Burt Burfict on. He shows up on game tape, but he's not a workout guy. So I'm hoping this time around he kind of gets it right. And the way they cut him, I thought was kind of odd because they added a third quarterback, and all the scouting reports on Jeff Driscoll, he seems like Dan LaFleur over again. The whole thing, very athletic. He runs, not a great NFL passer. It's almost like an odd extended tryout. I don't know if maybe the team was really high on him, wanted to draft him this year and thought, hey, here's a chance to bring him and we'll kick Dawson to the curb. And even Marvin Lewis's comments in his press conference, he made a comment about how when someone asked him, what do you think you'll add Dawson to the practice squad? He kind of made it sound like, well, he didn't say hoping, but you kind of read between the lines. He was kind of saying, well, we're kind of hoping, someone picks him up so we don't have to deal with that. So, yeah, the whole thing just seems kind of strange. I mean, I understand why they want to do it. They're trying to send a message, and he's not one of their guys. But at the end of the day, you need talent. You need people on the field. And if they can turn him around like they did with, guys like Dunlap and Burfict, I think he would be a great addition. But we'll just have to see what happens.
Connor, what do you make of the team currently carrying three quarterbacks on the active roster? I mean, for the last couple of years, they've carried two. Do you think this is a byproduct of the injury to Andy Dalton last year? Do you think they really love this Jeff Driscoll kid? Do you think it's a combination of factors?
I mean, it's definitely an interesting move. And I think the first thing to point out is obviously, I believe he was a rookie this year. And so it makes sense the team probably just really liked him in their whole scouting process. And maybe they just thought he was a guy that they couldn't get away. Obviously, the whole adding Driscoll thing is going to add more speculation onto should the Bengals trade A.J. McCarron, how soon can they trade him? And we talked about this last week with the whole what's A.J. McCarron's actual trade value. The Bengals really aren't going to take anything that's not a very high asking price, similar to what Sam Bradford just got in Minnesota. And so it's ultimately what it comes down to is they have right now one of the best backup quarterbacks in the NFL. And when you have a contending roster, you want a good backup quarterback. And so I don't know, maybe it's just they added Driscoll and they're thinking about, all right, well, eventually they'd be dumb to say that they don't anticipate A.J. McCarron will not be on the team at some point in the near future, because whatever happens, he's going to be on the team. He's not going to be on the Bengals in 2018, barring a career-threatening injury to Andy Dalton or something astronomically crazy that we've never comprehended before. I mean, Dalton's the starter unless Dalton really, really, really stinks it up or gets severely injured. And so with that knowledge, McCarron, who's a guy who's put on tape that potentially he could be a starting quarterback for a team, they're going to have to part ways eventually, whether that's just via free agency and they'll probably get a 3rd or 4th round comp pick as a result, or potentially via trade where you could get maybe as high as a 2nd or a 1st rounder, or maybe multiple picks for letting him go. So it's definitely an interesting move. I really find it interesting that they're keeping 3 quarterbacks on an active roster. I think a lot of people are quick to just say this is going to kill special teams depth, all of this stuff, when in all reality, the 53rd man on the roster, guy who's going to be inactive. So it's just giving him an opportunity to prove himself. I think with the Vontaze Burfict suspension, Burfict's obviously out for 3 games. He's going to return in week 4. I think it's more of an extended tryout for Driscoll. And obviously people are very opinionated about him. It seems like Bengal fans aren't exactly super high on him. I personally just want to give the guy a chance, man. I mean, at the end of the day, certain players respond differently to certain different circumstances. We saw that Dawson obviously couldn't stay motivated in Cincinnati. Maybe Cincinnati's style motivates Driscoll, or maybe it doesn't. But you really don't know about the guy until you give him a chance in the system that he's potentially going to play in. And just because he didn't work out in San Francisco and got cut for a guy like Christian Ponder, who is kind of a punching joke or a punchline in the NFL. I don't know how I got that wrong, but he's punching a punchline in the NFL, and just to help for him. But what if the Bengals offense is just more tailored to his strengths? So we really don't know. I think it's more of an extended tryout. I don't think it's time to freak out about the quarterback situation.
Connor, that was one thing you mentioned, Ponder, that looking back, just how good the Bengals have been doing. Ponder, Kaepernick, and Gabbert all came in that same draft when the Bengals got Dalton. And just looking to see what one good or bad quarterback can really do.
Yeah, Jake Locker was another guy.
Ryan Mallett too. The cannon of an arm.
Yep.
Throw it straight into the fans.
Exactly. So here's the thing, and it's a good segue, Connor, to the next part of what I want to talk about with the final roster and how it's constructed. I understand if the Bengals like Driscoll, his skill set, and that he's a guy that they want to develop. Okay. And they felt that he maybe was a guy that wouldn't be around, would get snagged off of their practice squad, whatever the scenarios that played out in their minds that made him a guy they wanted to keep as a 3rd quarterback on the active roster. My problem is with, if you cut PJ Dawson, you have Vontaze Burfict suspended. You now have Andrew Billings, who's basically out for the year. You've got William Jackson III, who's out for the year. There are spots on this team that seem to be that need some back end help, and they use that opportunity on a quarterback that they want to develop that will probably never see the field really for them at any point, unless there, as it currently stands, an injury to Andy Dalton and an injury to A.J. McCarron. So I don't really understand the move. And one area that is really weak, which is kind of surprising behind the starters, is the defensive line. And I look at, aside from Pat Sims, but he's a guy who missed practice with an Achilles issue on Wednesday. Aside from him, you have Margus Hunt, you have Will Clark, and you have Deshaun Williams, who have combined in their respective careers for 2 quarterback sacks. And this is a team that has relied on rotational players. Even though the starters play a significant amount of snaps, they still rely on rotational players to come in, get pressure, get sacks, to relieve some of the snaps that those starters are taking. So, Scott, are you worried about the defensive line depth, which was one of the deepest spots going into training camp?
I'd say I'm half worried. And you kind of nailed it with the defensive ends. And watching that last game, I don't know what kind of spin move that is that Will Clark's trying to do, but that thing was just horribly ineffective. And watching him and watching Hunt, he looks more like a 3-4 end, where he seems to have some good strength and push, but just no speed. So I'd say from a pass rush perspective, I'd be worried if Dunlap goes down. I think our sack totals are going to take a major hit, because I just don't see any sort of pass rush coming from Clark or Hunt. I think they might hold up well enough as far as setting an edge, maybe doing a little against the run, but yeah, that they just don't have any sort of pass rush. And you kind of see why teams put such an emphasis on reaching for pass rushers in the draft, even the kind of tweener guys who can't do anything more than pass rush, because they're just hard to find. And you look at the Bengals roster, and even Johnson, the starter, has kind of been hit or miss. And then the two backups, they just don't seem to have it. And then you mentioned the interior of the line. That's another area where I think a lot of us were pretty excited. We have Billings to eventually come in and replace Pecco. We have Hardison, who looked really good last year, and now they're both out. And you obviously have Atkins, but you hope he stays healthy. And then you have Sims, who you hope lasts a whole season. And then you said, Thompson was on the pup, and I think last year he only played like 8 or 9 games. So yeah, it's one of these things where last year the Bengals were extremely healthy, and I think this team's going to go as far as the health lets them go.
My friend Connor Howe has had an interesting week in terms of the Bengals defensive line. And I say that because he not only had an interaction with Deshaun Williams via Twitter, and hopefully we can get Deshaun Williams on this show. He's a guy actually that I think we're all pretty happy that made the final roster. But Connor did have a little interaction with Deshaun Williams via Twitter. And aside from that, you also put up kind of a little bit of a divisive post on Margus Hunt. And while a lot of us kind of feel the same way Scott does, and what he just expressed about Margus Hunt, his performances in the preseason, his performances in the regular season to date, you feel as if he's kind of the best of the bunch and still could be a good contributor this year behind Michael Johnson or Carlos Dunlap. Why do you feel that way?
Yeah, I don't think anything Scott said was wrong, just necessarily. I think, honestly, and I love to write things that are divisive, by the way. That's just what I thrive off of. I love the debate. I love the just whatever it is.
Such a pot stir. Such a pot stir.
I love this. I mean, I just like to stir the pot, man. And ultimately what it comes down to.
Probably divisive.
Yeah. And I mean, my whole post, honestly, was just, I just sat down and I've seen so many comments about Margus Hunt. And obviously people are going to feel a certain way about a guy. But do people have tape and do the research and do what it takes and really, like, can they legitimately say Margus Hunt brings absolutely nothing to the table? He's the worst player on the 53-man roster. No, actually he's not. He's the worst player that's ever played in Bengal stripes. I saw that comment. And I was thinking to myself, what have you been watching? Because, look, Hunt isn't the greatest player on the team. There's no doubt about that. And like Scott mentioned, I think he would look better probably as a 3-4 defensive end. But there's certain things that he brings to the table that I think people are definitely undervaluing. And you mentioned Will Clark's spin move, AC, or I don't know which one of you mentioned. I think it was AC. Well, I mean, Will Clark, I don't want to rail on the guy, but he's probably a better pass rusher than Hunt, but he sense of awareness, I don't think, of the field at all. He bites on play action quicker than anyone I've watched on the Bengals team. He's pretty decent at the pass rush, but he can't set the edge on the outside. And I think ultimately what it comes down to at the defensive end position, coming from a guy, humble brag, who's played college intramural flag football as a defensive end, no big deal. But but number one objective as a defensive end is always just set the edge. It's a huge help if you can also rush the passer. But ultimately, teams need to stop the run before they can rush the pass. And so that's what's so great about having Michael Johnson. Fans are gonna harp on him all the time, and they're gonna say whatever they want to say about him in terms of, oh, well, he hasn't had the double-digit sacks since 2012 or whenever it was, and they're going to undervalue him as a player just because of that. But when you have a guy like Johnson who can set the edge on one side and Gina who can disrupt in the middle, that just frees up Carlos Dunlap. I mean, and that's what's great about Dunlap also is he's a great run stopper. But you're not going to have an effective pass rush if you can't stop the run, because you're not going to be rushing the pass if another team can run on you. And so with Marcus Hunt, I think just what people are failing to understand is that every player has pros and cons, and Hunt is no different. Hunt definitely has cons. He's definitely a pretty inconsistent player, and for every great play you see from him, you definitely see an equally frustrating play from him. But this preseason, if you pay attention, he caught on to every screen pass that came his way. I believe they threw 3 screen passes his way. He was much more effective sealing the edge. And he just ultimately what it came down to is he generated pressure up the middle. And I counted 6 pressures and then 6 quarterback hits. So it's a total of 12 plays where he was very close to the quarterback. I don't think Clark was anywhere near that. And Deshaun Williams definitely looked effective as well. But what it comes down to is just that Hunt is a more balanced, I think, player than Will Clark. Will Clark still has upside. Hunt, I mean, it remains to be seen because he's old, and fans are going to knock him for that too. But ultimately what it comes down to is just Hunt right now in the nickel package. It's also just a matter of, is he an upgrade over Wallace Gilberry? And Gilberry didn't have a great year last year. He was pretty ineffective. And so if Hunt gets 3 sacks this year and doesn't give up any big plays against the run, I'd call that a good year from him. Expectations aren't sky high for him. They're not. Fans are gonna kill Hunt because he's a 2nd-round pick. But I just think that, honestly, coming from a guy who watched every single snap, just trying to look at it objectively as objectively as possible, that he's not as bad as what people are making him out to be. That's all I can say.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's definitely one of those lightning rods that fans tend to gravitate to in terms of their ire him, Russell Bodine, and Brandon Tate, who's now gone. Scott, you had a couple of additional thoughts on the roster.
Yeah, just a couple things after watching that Colts game. The first thing that popped in my mind early in that game was wondering if the Bengals had any buyer's remorse on keeping Erickson over Tate. He had that, I think he had a drop pass in the first half and fielded a punt, I think, inside the 10. And right after seeing, I think they were both in the first quarter, and my first thought was, man, they've got to be, doubting themselves because that was always the thing with Tate, was he's a very reliable, he doesn't make those mistakes. And first punt Erickson gets, catches it there on like the 5-6 yard line. But he looked much better in the second half. So that was a little better to see. But yeah, that initial time we saw him out there after that third game when everyone's like, wow, this is our guy. I can't believe we're cutting Tate. And then you kind of see that and you realize, okay, this guy's still a rookie. Hopefully they're willing to stick with him and see if he can show us what he's shown us. And the one other thing I wanted to mention was I was very excited to see Hopkins make the roster. Guy a couple years ago in training camp preseason looked awesome and then got hurt last year. He played that whole Colts game, I think, at left tackle. Looked very good. Didn't seem to give up any pressures. Seemed to do a good job in the run game. I was very happy to see him get that, especially with Oboye being hurt. And I think Jake Fisher's had some injury problems. And I think Connor's mentioned some of the other podcasts about Hopkins even starting over Oboye in the past. So I was just really excited to see Hopkins make that.
He looked good, man. He looked good at tackle.
Yeah,
I was surprised by that because I think the Bengals kind of plugged him in there just just to see, can he play tackle? Because I think he probably has in years past. As you mentioned, he competed against Oboye. I assume he played tackle in years past, but the Bengals probably tried to transition him to a guard. But he looked good.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of position groups where you kind of knew what was going to happen. A couple of other position groups you were a little bummed out because of the injuries that, especially to William Jackson III and Andrew Billings, you're a little bummed out that you're not seeing their names on that roster. But good points by both you guys. Obviously, good analysis. I will be watching the defensive line. I really worry about the depth there. I hope Connor and his optimism with Hunt is warranted, and he proves that. I do want to say that the Bengals, usually if they make a veteran addition towards the season, they usually do it after game one because of the way that money goes to players in terms of guarantees and when they sign a contract. So there could be more additions after this week, after week 2, if the Bengals notice some issues at some of those spots and they want to fill out the roster with maybe some guys that are still floating out there on waivers. So there is a possibility that the team does that. So we'll update you on that. We have a new segment, and we've been kicking around a couple of new segments over the past couple of weeks. And this is the brainchild of Connor, so I'm going to turn the reins over to him. But Connor, you've kind of become a little Bovada guru here with some over-unders, and you have some interesting numbers that you want to ask us about, I think, in regards to some stats and points and all of that in the Bengals' performance against the Jets. So, floor is yours.
Yeah, and just a quick mention. I think that you're right, AC, about the whole defensive line depth. It's definitely, regardless of what you think about Hunt or Clark or Williams, that makes one guy behind the starters, and plus Sims / Brandon Thompson will come back later. That's still not enough depth for a position that was one of the deepest in the NFL last year. But anyways, let's get into the over-unders. So I think a lot of people know how it works, but I'm just going to reiterate just for the people who don't. Basically, the way odds makers do it is you basically just pick a number that you think is feasible. So with the Rams, if you're going to predict an over-under for the Rams season, you're probably going to predict 7.5 wins because you want them to lean one way or the other. And the Rams are perennially either a 7-9 or 8-8 team. And so you're kind of just trying to set a middle ground where you think, okay, this is probably what he's going to get around, but let's decide, is he going to do better or worse than that? And so heading into the Jets game, I think it's definitely a great way to discuss what we think is going to happen and how effective the team is going to be based on a couple of over and under. Sorry. So, how effective is the run game going to be? Can the receivers step up? How will Andy Dalton look, and how's the defense going to play? So with that being said, I'll kick it over to you guys. Scott, you can go first. Jeremy Hill, 75 total yards, rushing and receiving. Do you think he's going to hit 75, more than 75, or is he going to get cut short of that?
I'm going to say under. And the main reason I'm going to say under is I think the Jets only gave up like 80, 84 yards rushing per game last year, which I think was first or second in the NFL. And yeah, I know they're missing the one guy, but they still have Leonard Williams. They still have Muhammad Wilkerson. So I think they're going to have a hard road to go, especially when he's losing carries to Bernard. So I'm going to go under with that.
I'm going to agree with Scott, and I'm going to say under as well. Hill can catch the ball, but he definitely doesn't have the receiving skills that Giovanni Bernard does. And that even without Sheldon Richardson, who we mentioned with John, that is serving that suspension, I think it's going to be a tough go of it with on the ground for either back. So I'll go under on that.
Cautious under for you guys. I'm just going to take the over. I think
Potster.
Call me optimistic, man. Call me optimistic. But okay, I think one thing that Jets fans really, from what I've seen, and obviously I'm sure there's some people who are accounting for this, but the loss of Damon Harrison, aka Big Snacks, to the Giants, who was their nose tackle, he was the centerpiece of their run defense. I mean, as someone who watched the Chargers growing up, as soon as they lost their all-pro nose tackle, Jamal Williams, their run defense just took a turn for the worse. And you could say the same thing about the Steelers after they lost Casey Hampton. So I think the Big Snacks Harrison being gone, along with Sheldon Richardson, I think people are overhyping Leonard Williams. Yeah, he was the 6th overall pick. Yeah, he's been good. Has he been great? He's not. I think he's been good. I think he's been at the level of a Michael Johnson-ish. So I'm just going to take the over. I liked what I saw from Hill in the preseason. I hope that he comes out of the gates hot, and I think he's going to do that. So now we're going to kick it to Gio Bernard. Maybe you guys feel differently about him. The over's a little, or the parameters are a little lower, just because he's obviously the number 2 there in the backfield. 50 total yards, rushing and receiving. How about you, Scott?
I'm going to say over on that. And part of the reason I'm saying that is I'm assuming Green is going to be on Revis Island all day. So I think Dalton's going to be spreading the ball around. And without Jones or Sanu and Eifert, I'm guessing Bernard's probably going to be a big recipient of passing yards this week.
I agree, especially with Dalton still getting comfortable with Brandon LaFell and Tyler Boyd in that offense and growing chemistry there. I think Bernard's going to be a dump-off option quite frequently. He did have last year, he did have his highest yards per reception number last year, as well as yards per carry and rushing yards. But I think 50 total yards for Giovanni Bernard is pretty easily achievable, even against a pretty good Jets defense.
Yeah, I probably should have set the bar higher. I'm definitely also going to take the over, which is going to make it pretty difficult or pretty interesting to see where things pan out. But I agree with you guys. The Jets have pretty decent linebackers, I should say David Harris is okay, but they have some pretty unproven linebackers. I think that Bernard's going to whiz around them in coverage, and he's probably going to make them look pretty silly on a couple of plays. So now we go to AJ Green, and as you mentioned, Scott, he's going up against Revis Island. And then the cornerback depth, as I think John is his name mentioned, is pretty suspect behind Revis with Buster Screen and a bunch of guys whose names I do not know. So over under for AJ Green, 75 yards.
I'm just going to play law of averages and say under because that works out to be 1,200 yards in a year. So I'm going to say he has some huge games and some games below that. So this is probably one of his toughest matchups, along with Hayden, who he tends to struggle with. So I'm going to go under, just doing math.
We gotta stop agreeing here, Scott. We gotta butt heads here a little more. I'm gonna agree, and it's not
so conservative.
It's not an indictment of AJ Green. It's not an indictment of Andy Dalton, and it's not even the law of averages that Scott mentioned. But it's more. I think the Jets are going to bracket a ton of coverage to AJ Green, and it's not just the Revis Island thing. I think they're going to bring a lot of guys over to him. There's no Tyler Eifert. I think they're going to try and make Andy Dalton, Brandon LaFell, and Tyler Boyd beat them, and you'll see double and triple coverages, even with Darrelle Revis on him. I think they're not going to let AJ Green out of their sight too often. So I'm going to say under on that one.
Devil's advocate here, but isn't that what every team tries to do with AJ Green? I think you guys are being a little bit conservative here. Personally, I think
one more thing. I'm sorry, one more thing, Connor. You also have an offensive coordinator who's calling plays for the first time in his career against a pretty good defense. So if AJ Green is if he's having trouble getting open, I'd be a little worried about Zampese's ability to adjust either at halftime or whatever. That's another concern I have. Didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry.
Fair. Definitely fair, man. No, you got to bring that in because that's actually something that people I think need to consider, especially myself. I think it's easy to think the Bengals are going to get a hot start as they have, especially last year. But I definitely think it's going to be definitely more difficult for the offense to progress early on. That being said, I think the Jets safeties, they have Calvin Pryor, Gilchrist is the other guy. And both of them have been pretty good. Pryor is a lot more of a box safety type of – I mean, I think he plays free safety, but I mean that his skill set is more tailored towards laying that big hit on someone. I think he's a guy where Green can just and burn him deep. I don't think Green is just going to catch 80 passes, but I think – I just have a hunch that Green is one play, whether it's against Revis or someone else, bracket coverage or not. I think he's going to put a double move on someone, burn him, and then I'm just going to say let's say a 40-plus yard catch. I think he's going to have at least one of those, and for that reason, I think he's going to have at least 75 yards. So I'm going to take the over. Let's go down to the quarterback now with Andy Dalton coming back for his first game since he got hurt against the Steelers late in last year. And last year, as we saw, he got off to an early hot start. I'm probably being a little bit too generous here, I should say I should probably set it lower, but I have Dalton right now at 2.5 touchdowns. So if you take the over, he's throwing 3 or more. If you take the under, he's throwing 2 touchdowns or fewer. Do you think the Bengals are going to try to air it out for the end zone? Do you think they're going to try to pound the ball into the end zone via the run game is basically the question here.
And I'm going to be the naysayer again and take the under. And main reason is just doing the math. That's 40 touchdowns. I don't see Dalton throwing 40 touchdowns. I'm thinking, it's the first week of the year. They don't have Eifert. They are still trying to figure out what they have with Boyd, with LaFell. The passing may be suspect as they try to get everything put together. You mentioned new offensive coordinator. So I'm going to say, 1 or 2 touchdown passes. 3 I'd be happy with, but yeah, I'd be very surprised in the first week with that much turnover that he gets 3 of them.
Just to play contrarian, I guess I'll say over. And I reluctantly say that. I definitely agree with a lot of what Scott said. The one thing I think that may play into Dalton getting some touchdown passes, he might get a couple of cheapies. And what I mean by that is he may do kind of a little swing out to Giovanni Bernard. He could do a little, a shovel pass here and there, and just to kind of mix things up. Not necessarily the big bombs to AJ Green or anybody else, but I do agree Eifert not being there as the red zone threat's a huge deal. But I do think there is an opportunity especially if he maybe stays away from the Revis side of the field, there is an opportunity to kind of get creative and maybe get some of those short range touchdowns and get 3. It'll be difficult, but it can be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think he had 3 last season in week 1. And what I will say also, I think, is that who knows, maybe if the Bengals offensive line / red zone, Dalton's going to try to throw one of those fades to Green or Boyd or whoever it may be. I think the Bengals have shown a tendency to do that in years past. That being said, AC killed our first chance at going unanimous here. I'm going to take the under as well with Scott. I think it's going to be 1 or 2. I think the Bengals are going to try to pound into the end zone with Hill if they're anywhere close within the 5-yard line, as they kind of showed they wanted to do against Indianapolis, even though they failed, or maybe it was the game before against Jacksonville, but they failed in doing that until the 3rd or so attempt. So we've got okay, here we go. So we've got another one here with Dalton. The over-under at 0.5, 1/2 interceptions. Basically, is he going to throw a pick this game? Is he not going to throw a pick this game? I'll start with Scott.
I like saying under, so I'm just going to say under again. I'm very good at saying that. I'd say also it's not prime time, and I think Dalton only threw like 7. Granted, he missed a few weeks, but he only threw 7 or 8 off last year. And it's Sunday at 1:00. I just don't see it happening. So I'm going to go 0.
I'll say over. And I think it's 1. If it's at 0.5. I don't think it's the same Andy Dalton who forces the football that we saw through his first couple of years. I mean, I think you saw quite a bit of growth with that, but I just think with the new receivers, they may not be totally on this. I mean, obviously there's a lot of good positive chatter that they're doing well and they're jiving well in practice, but games are a completely different thing, especially against a pretty good defense. And if the Jets defensive line can get pressure on Dalton, he may throw an errant ball and get a turnover. I don't think there's going to be a huge amount, but I do see maybe 1 interception.
I'm also going to take the over with AC. I think that one thing that I could just envision happening here is they pound into the red zone, and Dalton, like I said earlier, tries one of those fades to AJ, kind of gets his confidence going, tries to test Revis or whoever it may be that's guarding Green. I remember the Ravens game last year, and he threw one straight to Jimmy Smith, I believe, that was one of those, oh man, I wish I had that back throws. And that was one of the only picks I saw last year that was really one of those just 2011, 2012 Dalton throws. So yeah, I'm going to take the over as well, AC. So now we're going to head down to the secondary here, and we're going to go with interceptions. And obviously the Bengals are facing Ryan Fitzpatrick. And I think the media kind of overplayed the whole Ryan Fitzpatrick being absent thing. He was there for all of training camp for what it's worth. But that being said, Cincinnati has a secondary that's been among the league leaders in interceptions in the past every year since 2013. I think they've had at least 20 picks on the year. So the over-under here is going to be 1.5 interceptions, 1 or less, or 2 or more pretty much. So I'll start with you, Scott.
I think at this point I just have to say under. I think I'm just the under guy. I'm looking at, you lost
there.
Yeah, you lost Reggie Nelson. He said there's eight interceptions right there. You have the depleted secondary with William Jackson being out. I know Jones has missed some time when he got hurt warming up. So I just don't know I think the secondary is going to be good. I just don't know if it's going to start out as solid as last year. So, and plus with Denard out too. So I'm just going to say under. I think they get 1. I'd love to see 2 or 3 or 4, but yeah, it's easy to say under. So I'll say under.
Yeah, I'll say under as well. I think 1 is reasonable.
We got the clean sweep there. Well, I'll go 1. I think the reason why is I've mentioned it before on the podcast and vehemently over the written posts I've written, but I think the whole Sean Williams factor is something the Bengals are definitely going to have to consider. And how confident are you in having 2 deep safeties, and basically how aggressive can you play with your corners, especially going up against a tandem like Brandon Marshall and Eric Decker, and maybe it's a linebacker like Dansby or something who gets a pick. I know that the tight end position is probably going to be pretty weak in New York, so maybe the Bengals have an advantage over there against the linebacker, but it's hard to see the team ending up with multiple picks against a fast-paced offense with Chan Gailey as offensive coordinator and Fitzpatrick as the quarterback when they're slinging those passes left and right pretty quickly. Not a lot of time in the pocket, so we'll take the unanimous under here. On to UAC.
All right. Well, that is the over/under segment with Connor Howe. That was fun, buddy. We had a little too much agreement, but
I think I should set the under next time at 0 so that Scott has to say over.
That's what you got to do, man.
Unless it's rushing yards. If it's rushing yards, I still might say under, depending on who we're talking about.
It's a fun game and a good segment. That's again the weekly over/unders with Connor Howe. Appreciate you doing that. Let's try and make this a little quick, and not only quick, but we got to, unfortunately, because of the subject matter, we got to tread a little lightly. But it's major headlines, not only in the NFL, but also really just in pop culture right now. And it's the whole Colin Kaepernick taking a knee and not involving himself in the national anthem. There's a lot of politics behind that. There's a lot of emotion behind that. There's a lot of, whatever else you want to say, racial tension. There's all kinds of issues that are underneath the surface here. I'm going to start with Scott because he's also writing a post on this topic, but it is very prevalent. It is something that a lot of people are talking about right now. What are your thoughts? Agree, disagree? Maybe you have a different stance outside of the politics type of arena. What are your thoughts about what Colin Kaepernick's doing and the trickle-down effect, both positive and negative? Mostly negative, I think, in terms of his reputation from doing this. What? Just kind of some base thoughts and what you're basing your post on with this.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were negative. I think one interesting thing is that you go back to 2011 and Dalton and Kaepernick, and we have Dalton obviously, are always going to be kind of linked together, especially with Bengals fans because they were drafted back to back. When they were drafted, there was the kind of the rumor that kind of leaked out that, the Bengals were leaning Kaepernick, Mike Brown wanted Kaepernick, Gruden convinced him to go the other way, and Kaepernick had the early success, went to the Super Bowl. So there's always going to be that tie between the two until they retire. And years later, we can say the one is better. And after the early part of their career, I know on Cincy Jungle, we had a lot of people grumbling, saying, I can't believe, we passed on Kaepernick. How could we pass on Kaepernick? Look at how great he's doing. And you look at him now, and their careers couldn't be further apart. And same with what's happening on the field. They can't be further apart. The only thing we really know about Dalton off the field is he likes Christian music, and he wears a rubber ring for a wedding ring. That's kind of the two things we really know about Dalton.
And he lost his luggage.
Yeah, apparently.
Luggage Gate 2016.
Yeah, apparently he needs to learn the whole bungee cord thing to strap it on the top of the roof or whatever happened. So, he seems like a pretty clean cut, low profile kind of guy. Kaepernick obviously has taken it a different direction with the really big stand. And I think it raises some really good questions. And even the president kind of weighed in on it over in China. And I think one of the things that a lot of people really haven't looked at, one angle or perspective to kind of look at it, is kind of where this is happening and the debate that really isn't happening of whether is it appropriate or not appropriate to do this in this venue or in this location. Because you kind of look at, the whole idea of America has always been, you've always been, you're allowed to assemble and free speech and, assemble in the public square, and you have the big marches at the National Mall and people get together and protest and have sit-ins and boycotts and all that kind of stuff. And that's one thing. This is a little different because it's happening at an NFL game. So you're an employee, you're at an employer event. You have people who are paying to come to this. So it's not really, the same thing as like public square. It's not town square. It's a private venue where you're kind of, the people who are there are paying. They aren't really paying to see you make a protest. They're there to watch you play football. And so it kind of raises the question of, is this an appropriate spot or is it not? And I think we all probably have different views on that. And then you have the idea of, well, by rejecting the flag and the anthem, one of the big backlashes they seem to get was most people tend to tolerate, if you want to reject a particular thing about this country, whether it be, taxes, or I think a lot of people, there's a lot of divisive issues, religion, abortion, whatever. There's many things that are very divisive. And you tend to see people reject or protest those particular things. But when you reject something like the flag and the anthem, those are symbols of the whole country. So you're kind of at least visibly looking like you're rejecting the whole country. I know it's not what he's doing, but that's, what you initially see. A lot of the initial backlash was based on that you're rejecting the symbols of this country and everything it stands for, and even your right to make the protest. So I just think those are very interesting things that kind of get overlooked. The whole focus has been on the content, which is obviously what he's trying to do, get the talk on the content. But I just figure, being an NFL game and the venue, it's one aspect we're not really looking at is it acceptable? Is it not in this particular venue in this context? So I'll open up to you guys and see what you guys think of that.
Connor, additional thoughts?
I have to disagree with you a little bit, Scott, in the sense that the coverage has been more on the message. I think initially the biggest issue I had with this whole situation was that Kaepernick is, sitting at a national anthem. This wasn't even until the second or third game that he started the protest, I should say in quotes, that he even is doing it. Because ultimately, how many people at a game are walking or talking on the phone or not paying attention during the national anthem? Ultimately, I think what it comes down to is, from my personal opinion, obviously, the national anthem is something that it's a symbol of our freedom, but I don't think it's necessarily that. I think that paying tribute to the country via, singing the national anthem, putting your hand over your heart, is a tribute to the freedom that our soldiers have, earned us. But I ultimately, I think that that's not exactly a representation of that's how we honor the military. And I think that the whole hashtag Veterans for Kaepernick movement kind of opened people's eyes to that, in that veterans, some people will agree with Kaepernick, and that's okay. And that's what I think makes our country great, is the fact that we're allowed to disagree with each other, and we're not going to go to jail over the fact that we don't agree on the exact same issue. Ultimately, what I think is that Kaepernick's making a stand, and yeah, it's at an NFL venue, and people are going to the games, but is anyone actually watching Kaepernick sit down? People weren't watching him sit down until cameras were taking pictures of him sitting down. So I think it sparked conversation, and it accomplished what Kaepernick wanted to do, and he backed that up by donating $1 million of his own money, which is a lot of money regardless of how much money you're making. So I like the move, and I encourage anyone who is interested by the issue still today, check out what Uncle Chaps wrote, a former SB Nation correspondent now with Barstool Sports. He's a Purple Heart recipient, and he wrote a great column, I think, on Barstool Sports. You can check that out if you just probably Google it. And I also think that the video of what Kaepernick is saying to the media in terms of what he's standing up for, / I should say sitting down for here, I think that's something that got glanced over. I think that what Kaepernick actually has to say is just as important as the gesture of sitting. You look at a guy like Isaiah Crowell, who tweeted out a picture of a cop getting his throat slashed, and he gets, he says, okay, gets almost no backlash for it because he says, I'm going to donate one game check to the Dallas Police Department. So that's just my take, man.
For me, without getting super political or hyper emotional about the situation, for me, it comes down to a couple of things. And I look at what he's doing, and I see a really big show of hypocrisy. And what I mean by that is he's protesting in a country, and one of the most sacred showing of respect to the country. He's protesting that because he has the freedom of speech in this country, and in very few other countries, if any, around the world, if a professional athlete were to show that kind of disrespect to their nation, whether it's in the Olympics, whether it's imagine athletes who go through their national anthem in international soccer play, or the other football, if you will, if they did a similar type of showing in some of these third world countries, communist countries, other countries that have people that are very oppressed, under some very kind of heavy dictatorship kind of rule. There's just a really big sense of hypocrisy there that yes, he has the freedom of speech to be upset and be upset about some of these different and difficult situations that are going on in this country, and very divisive situations that are going on in this country. But he's refusing to see that he lives in a great country that allows him the freedom to be able to make this kind of protest. And that's kind of what bothers me about it, and what he's doing. Just the hypocrisy behind it. And he's doing it. He's knowingly doing it on one of the biggest national and international platforms, because American football is one of, if not, it's one of the most popular sports in the world, aside from soccer or football. And he knows that, and he's using that platform to do that. And that's okay. He has the freedom to do that. However, he's playing a game that pays him more money than many, many, many other people in this world receive, much less in the USA. So I have not only just the respect issue, I see a hypocrisy issue with what Colin Kaepernick is doing. And, this is also a sport that really, if you remember 15 years ago and up really until this point, has really rallied around the 9/11 attacks and all of that. They have the flag sticker on the helmets, and they really, all sports in this country have really rallied around that, and it really brought the country out of some really tough times. And I think that's now looked at in the rearview mirror with some of the things that Kaepernick is doing. He has the freedom to do that. That's what makes this country great, and he's expressing himself the way he wants to do that, and he's within his means to do that. I don't agree with it. I don't like the sign of disrespect. And there's a number of military veterans who probably agree with me, but that's kind of my stance. I see some hypocrisy. I see kind of a usage of a platform that not many others have in a way to further his platform there. But he does have the right to do it.
That's fair.
One thing Connor mentioned about how no one had really noticed it, which is interesting. In the article, I mentioned a couple other examples in the past where a similar protest had happened. I think Carlos Delgado in baseball refused to stand during the playing of God Bless America during the seventh inning in the early 2000s, a couple years after 9/11. And then there was the NBA player who back in, I think it was 96, wouldn't stand after he had converted him to Islam and wasn't standing for the anthem. And in both those cases, when you read the interviews, neither one really seemed to, it didn't seem to bother anyone, because no one seemed to notice it, because, there's a lot of people moving around, there's trainers, there's things happening. And sometimes it's, you're looking at the flag, you're not even looking at the players. But when they got interviewed and mentioned it, that was when all hell broke loose and everyone kind of went crazy. And I know in the NBA, they came up with a compromise with him. I think initially he got fined and maybe benched, and then the union stepped in and they agreed that he would stand, but he could say a Muslim prayer. And so you can find photos and pictures of him kind of doing a posture of a Muslim prayer while he's standing. And I'm guessing with Kaepernick, you don't know what'll happen, but I'm guessing they may come up with some sort of compromise. And the kneeling looked like it might have been in compromise. Like, I just won't flat out sit, but I'll kind of do a kneeling is, some people look as kneeling as kind of a reverent thing, but you're not standing. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what ends up happening. And if more people join in and, where it kind of goes from there.
Yeah, it's setting a dangerous precedent in not only for the NFL, but for other sports. I read somewhere that Colin Kaepernick, who fell from grace in terms of his play over the last year and a half, his jersey sales are now around the highest that they've ever been because of over the last couple of weeks because of what he's done here. And now you wonder about the trickle down effect of what he's doing. If other athletes are going to do that, will they be allowed to do that? And, I just think it sets a dangerous precedence for something that, I don't know. Again, as I mentioned, I feel like we live in a pretty good country that has a ton. There are a lot of issues, and Kaepernick is right in raising awareness to some of these issues that have been going on. But I'm not comfortable with the way that he is expressing it in what he's doing. And but again, what makes this country great is he has the freedom to do so.
That's fair. And we saw, I believe it was Eric Reed, his safety, or his teammate who's played safety, also joined him, as well as Jeremy Lane, who's a corner on the Seahawks. Yep. So it'll be interesting to see what happens down the road.
Yep. Well, it's not a Bengals issue, but it's an important one for football, and a very interesting, divisive topic that we could probably have our own show, if not our own podcast on this issue. But it's a good topic. Thanks for bringing that up, Scott. And as we mentioned, Scott will be having a post on Cincy Jungle, kind of expressing some of the sentiments we talked about here, as well as the non-political side of the issue. Let's lighten things up a little bit and end the show. The Bengals, as we have mentioned multiple times already, are traveling to New York, and I believe, if I'm taking Anthony Munoz's word for it, on the last preseason game, I believe the Bengals have not won in New York when playing the Jets since 1981. 35 years ago is the last time the Bengals have won in New York, if we're taking Anthony Munoz's word for it. I don't have the stats necessarily in front of me, but this is a talented Bengals team. They started off 8-0 last year, and they broke all kinds of stigmas over the past couple of years. Do the Bengals get it done? And if so, how do you expect them to get it done, Scott?
I as far as Munoz goes, I'd say, the same. We had the same thing with Oakland. I don't think we'd won in Oakland in like 20, 30 years until last year. So this is definitely the team to buck trends. I think the Bengals do it, but looking at that defense and looking at, kind of first game offensive coordinator, you're missing Eifert, still bringing in some people along as far as the receivers behind AJ. I picture it being a very low-scoring game. I think I'd like to see Hill and Bernard have success running. I assume it's going to be a little tough for them. I think they'll probably have some big plays, but probably get stuffed a few times. Green on Revis is probably going to be a challenge. As Connor's mentioned, I think I can see him, having a few big plays, but also having a couple where he gets shut down. So I'm expecting low-scoring defense and special teams, turnovers, the little things that win the game. Because both teams have really good defenses, and I just think it kind of comes down to something like that. So where we need our backup receivers and there are people to kind of come up big, maybe Erickson or defensive touchdown or something like that. So I'm going to say Bengals win 14-10 because I'm not trusting Nugent to kick a field goal. So I'm keeping it 14. I'm only going in increments of 7.
All right, Scott, going conservative once again, like you did in the over-unders. I like it. Connor.
It's definitely a struggle to think about what an actual score would be week one. I'm just going to go 24-17. I think for as strong as these teams look up front, both teams have secondaries, which can be, I should say, I think they're both suspect at this point. And I don't say that as in they're weak. I just think that both teams look susceptible to giving up potentially a big play or two. I can see either team breaking off a long touchdown on the other, Probably not to Iloka's side if it's by the Jets because he rarely gives up the big play, but I think that they'll probably test Sean Williams early. I think the Bengals are going to test the corners behind Revis, and keep in mind Revis isn't just going to shadow Green the whole game, so he will have snaps against screen and other guys, whether it be in bracket coverage or not. And if the Jets do decide to put Revis against Green one-on-one, how fast can he keep up with Green downfield? So yeah, I'm just going to go 24-17 Bengals. I think that I don't know. I just think that it doesn't have to be. I think they can score a lot without having to move the ball a ton. Maybe the punters struggle or something, or there's some turnovers. That's just the way I see things panning out.
I'm going to go 20-16 Bengals, and I think it's going to be tight. I think it's going to be, I don't want to call it ugly, but I don't know that there's going to be a total, even with all the good receivers out there and all of that. I don't know that there's going to be a ton of big plays. I think both teams are, it's week one. Teams are going to kind of get their footing underneath them. One thing to watch, and I think, Scott, you briefly touched on it, the extra points now have moved back quite a bit. And with Nugent struggling in the preseason, that's something to keep an eye on. And if you remember, Nugent was originally drafted by the Jets in the second round, probably 10 years or so ago now, I think. So he's returning back to New York, which is kind of an interesting little storyline in itself. But I do think the Bengals come out on top. I do expect Andy Dalton to really try and feed Tyler Boyd. And it's not just because I'm partial to the kid and I like what I saw out of him in preseason, but I do think Revis will be on Green quite often. I just think that's a matchup that the Jets want to try and get. And so I think they're going to shift around Boyd quite a bit and try and get him the ball out of the slot. Do the same with LaFell, but I do think they're going to try and use Boyd. I think he'll work well against some of those backup corners and make some plays, and the Bengals will do just enough to get past a pretty solid Jets team that just missed out on the playoffs last year, but was a 10-win squad.
Well, I noticed you said 20 and not 21 points and mentioned
there you go.
Nugent's kicking issues. So I'm assuming you're expecting the missed extra point.
Something like that.
And based on the over-under, I'm guessing one passing touchdown, or was it 2 passing touchdowns, 1 rushing touchdown, and 1 missed extra point?
There you go. Something like that. Yep.
I think one guy we haven't given enough respect on the podcast has definitely been Matt Forte. I don't necessarily think he's going to be that great between the tackles. I think the last time the Bengals played the Bears, I just looked it up, I think he had 50 yards on 2.6 yards per carry. And granted, that was a bad line, but the Jets don't have a great line either. They have Nick Mangold, and that's about it. So I think, that being said, I think Forte could play a pretty big role as a pass catcher out of the backfield. And if the linebackers, if Vinny Ray, who looked pretty slow in coverage last year when he was assigned to running backs, as well as, how's that going to factor in? And is Vinny Ray going to have to be responsible for Forte in coverage? Is he going to go to the tight end in nickel? Or is Dansby, which one of those two is going to be more responsible for the tight end / the running back? So that's something I'm definitely going to keep my eye on.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because one of my top 5 keys to victory this week in a post I'm putting up on Cincy Jungle is about Carlos Dunlap's impact, his potential shadowing of Matt Forte, especially because Dansby, even though he's up there in age, is probably the Bengals' best linebacker in coverage. He's made a living off of that in his career. He's a pretty well-rounded player in general, probably one of the most underrated, really, statistically in this generation. He's a very good football player. It remains to be seen if he still has enough in the tank to really help out the Bengals this year. But especially with Burfict out, who's a playmaker in himself, I think Dansby is under the spotlight. So that's a good point with Forte there. Do you like this show? If you like it, download it on iTunes. The Orange and Black Insider is officially on iTunes. You can rate the show. You can leave comments. You can contact us on Twitter at BengalsOBI. You can email us at the obinsider@gmail.com. You can contact us through Cincy Jungle. You can view these videos and everything we put up on our YouTube channel. So we have a SoundCloud account. You can download the audio there. Whatever works for you. Check out the show. Let us know what you think. We're doing some different things. We're doing some fun things. And we're like I said, we're 7 episodes in. We're having some fun. And we had a special guest tonight. So Thank you to John Butchko of Gangrene Nation and the Jets Lockdown podcast. He gave us great insight. The Bengals are taking on the Jets. It's week 1. Football's officially here. We hope you enjoyed the show. It'll be available on Cincy Jungle and, as I said, on iTunes, so download it. Scott Schultze, Connor Howe, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you, and hooday.
That's right. Hooday. Let's get a win this week.
Yeah, sorry, trying to get my mic working there.
Let's go 1-0.
1-0, baby.